So originally I wasn't going to give this its own dedicated video, but I've seen a lot more chatter about Nightingale's buff online. If you don't know, her third skill got buffed, and there just seems to be a lot of discussions going on whether or not the skill is actually good now, or if it just wasn't enough, or whether or not the buff itself was good in and of itself. There's just a lot of like nitty-gritty stuff going into this buff that I did not think was that complicated. I guess there are just a lot of die-hard Nightingale stands out there that I just did not think actually existed, but you know what? If it's that big of a deal, I'll come out and I'll give my 2 cents on it, because for the record, I think the buff is actually good. I just don't think it's enough to really push Nightingale into relevancy, and I'll kind of explain what I mean by that in today's video. But before we begin, if you've not already, make sure you leave a like on the video, you subscribe to the channel for that sweet daily FGO content. And if you want to come see me play FGO live and usually have some discussions about the game, other servants, you can ask me all sorts of questions live. I do stream every weekday starting at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time over on my Twitch, which is linked down in the description down below. Sometimes we play other games, but just because your boy is playing Arc Knights, or I don't know, maybe I'm playing Master Duel on the odd Monday or something, doesn't mean I won't answer your FGO question. So feel free to come out and ask whatever you want, because, you know, I'm pretty much just always answering questions and we're discussing Fate the entire time we're streaming. But with all that being said, let's go ahead and just talk about this. So for the people that do not know what this buff actually is, it just took her third skill and added like a 30% crit buster thing on there, right? And then it bombed 20 stars. Like, in and of itself, this is not a bad buff, right? Like this, if you look at this as a skill, you're like, this is nice, right? 50% buster for 3 turns. That's a huge steroid for whatever person's buster cards. And it's also going to give them a nice chunk of crit damage at 30% for 3 turns, while also providing them with some stars that Nightingale herself probably won't steal with this absolute poo-poo stinky star absorption she's got over here. So she's probably not going to steal any of those stars from them, which is a nice difference between her doing something like this and like a caster or a rider support doing it. Because if a caster or a rider bombs some stars, well, they're probably going to suck it back up for themselves because they just have very high natural star weight. So as a skill, you can understand why I do think this is a good buff. Like, this is a very strong skill. And we even know that while I would like a 50% crit damage buff, 30% is fine, because I believe that is also what Morgan also has over here on her skill. And let me tell you, Morgan is able to put out some very strong crits, even without being buffed by like Koyenskaya or Oberon or whoever else, right? Because I don't have either of those guys, and she could still do some very nasty crit damage over on the JP version of the game. You don't need ludicrously high crit levels to be able to do some good crit. So this should be fine, right? In theory. I think the problem comes down to the fact that Nightingale just does not offer some of the basic things that you want other supports to offer people. I know I talked about this in the cast skill video where I was talking about the new buff that he was able to give, where he actually now gives NP to the entire party, and that is probably the most crucial thing that you as a support can do. You need to be able to give your party immediate access to their NP, because like it or not, the thing that every servant in this game wants to do, whether or not they are a DPS, a support, even a self buffer, everybody wants to fire their NPs, right? The offensive servants want to be firing their NPs as often as possible to make sure that they are just doing damage to the enemy. Your support servants want to be firing their NPs as often as possible to make sure that they are supporting the party, they are doing their job. And self-buffers like, say, Super Orion want to spam their NPs so they just have crazy buffs up all the time. Or even someone like Chi Shi Huang, who's a survivability servant, even he wants to fire his NP all the time because it just gives him a lot of really nice buffs that synergize very well with his style of gameplay. The whole name of the game is fire your NP, right? That's why the supports that give like 50% NP are so crazy strong. It's still why Castoria is going to be strong for quite a long time, even as just like double Castoria, because that is 60% NP for the entire party. That is nuts. That is so dummy good. And the fact that Nightingale just as a support can't offer that is always going to inherently hurt her. It's the same thing with like Miss Crane and Tamamu for me, right? That as much as I like to say how good those servants are and how much fun they can be to use in your team comps, you're just not going to be as incentivized to use them because they don't offer you immediate NP. Even Miss Crane, who can do a 100% battery and fire her NP and then give NP on her NP, you still technically don't feel the effects of that until the next turn because you can't attack in the middle of your, attack animations. Maybe that'll change for some crazy servant, right? Like they're like, oh, as soon as I hit 100%, I auto NP, but I still think we're like a couple years off from something that crazy being a thing. So regardless, I think all they really need to do to make it to where Nightingale herself can kind of compete with these other supports that give those fat globs of NP is very simple. Just make this skill targetable, right? If you make this a targetable skill, and then, I don't know, throw just literally anything on here, just some additional buff. Maybe it's like an attack buff, maybe it's an NP damage buff, just anything. It would at least make Nightingale a very good niche support type plug suit servant that you could plug suit in if you don't have someone like, say, Oberon to really gas up your damage, because then she could come and give you the humanoid special damage mod, which is, you know, just basically every single servant over here, right? Yeah, like, look, it's everybody except these guys, right? It would be really good for a lot of different boss fights because practically every single servant is a humanoid. It's really good for like a bunch of like random bumbliest enemies as well. It's really good for fighting them. And then it also, in more difficult content, would also give them a nice little defensive buff. She would give them a couple of stars, some nice crit damage, a nice buster buff, and could really start them off very strong in the fight. But because they still haven't like gotten around to buffing this skill, she's just not quite there yet, which is why I say that this is a good skill. I don't think you could really tell me that this is bad, but it's just not enough yet. Like, Nightingale is just one of those servants, like much of the other year 1 servants, that just needs a little bit more help, right? It's just, you got to be patient with it. It is very exciting for them to start getting a bit better and they start getting buffs, but you're going to have to wait a couple more months for them to kind of roll around and maybe do the second skill, or God forbid it's a couple months and not like 2 years. I do hope that FGO keeps up this trend of just constantly buffing their servants, because we have so many servants in the game that are just absolutely lacking. And I don't need them to be competitive with like the new servants. I don't need Nightingale to be as good as like Koyenskaya or Oberon, but at the very least, have a reason to use them, right? Because at least right now, it's like if you're using Nightingale, you might be a little down bad, right? Because if you wanted the big buster buff, I guess you could also use someone like, say, Chen Gong, right? Who's a much cheaper option. It's not going to eat up a lot of your team costs, because that is still something that is a little relevant that people never consider, is that a lot of these servants are very expensive. And since we're just like not getting buffs to our overall team cost, it can be kind of a burden to bring a lot of different 5 stars, because then you can't bring CEs and it gets really annoying, right? So if they just make that a little bit more worth it by adding that, and you know, if they really just wanted to like top this servant off and make her really insane, she could have like a 30% targetable battery on this plus like 20% NP damage that also synergizes with Oberon really well. That I think would make her real cracked. But even simply just adding the targetability on this, and then just an attack buff, NP damage buff, even like buster down, just something that kind of synergizes, that's not another buster buff, so you can kind of get those multiplicative buffs as well. It would at least make it nice for people that really like Nightingale and want to get some value out of her, but just can't really find the excuse to use her outside of just liking the servant, right? Because there's no way you're ever going to keep Nightingale on the field. There's just not a chance that you're going to keep a Berserker support around. They're just going to explode too easily, unless you're using her in conjunction with like Reigns, because Reigns' NP can nullify that and make her take neutral damage, with like the 25% here could make her a little tanky, I suppose. But I don't know, maybe if they want to do like a real crazy buff, they could have this if they want to keep it as a self buff, which I don't think it should be a self buff. I think you can make it targetable and it makes her way, way better. But you could also give her the ability to like nullify Berserker class defense down or whatever, right? Like, you can make it to where she doesn't take just loads of damage from enemies. Something like that could be good. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts in the comments down below. It's just, I hear so many people talking about this, and I've been asked about it for like the last 3 days on my stream. People are like, what do you think about Nightingale's buff? And I'm like, okay, let me just make a video about it. So now everybody can be like, all right, now I know what he thinks. He thinks it's good, but he thinks she could use a little bit more, because like a lot of these year 1 servants, they do just be lacking in little areas because the game was just different, right? They didn't have break bars at the time. So like, just being able to be like, oh, here's big major damage to absolutely blow the boss's back out is just good enough. I mean, Nightingale was really, really strong during, I believe it was the Rashomon raid when Ibaraki first came out, because if you had a Nightingale, you could just like really buff up any of your servants and just make them do insane levels of damage, and that was it. But now we have break bars and you need more longevity and blah, 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 all the boring stuff of modern FGO gameplay, right? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below, because sometimes you guys have like really interesting ideas for like a character's lore or whatnot, or like what they should be able to do. I just presented two ideas, right? We either make this a targetable thing, or if you want Nightingale to stick around and you want her to be on the board, right? You want her to be there. You want people to use her as a support for like the entire battle or whatever. You don't want her to just be a plug suit. Then at least give her some way to reduce this, right? Because this was a very interesting idea, but it's not a very good one, right? Because you want your supports to last more than one turn, honestly. But with all that being said, I'm going to go ahead and get out of here. You guys have yourselves a nice day. Peace, late, guys.